China turned a desert into a forest. That sentence is true. It is also deeply, dangerously incomplete. Between 1978 and today, China planted approximately 78 billion trees across its northern frontier, the largest environmental project in the history of human civilization. Satellite data confirmed it. NASA confirmed it. The Gobi Desert, which was swallowing 10,000 square kilometers of land every single year, an area larger than Cyprus, gone annually, taken without trace, began to shrink. The numbers looked like a miracle. But here is what the numbers didn't say. In Ningxia province, a single disease outbreak in the year 2000 killed 1 billion trees in 12 months. 20 years of planting. 1 year. Gone. In the dry northwest, scientists discovered that the forests were quietly using up the very groundwater they needed to survive. And in test plots in northern Shanxi, researchers found something that should have been impossible. Land that was simply left alone, nothing planted, nothing done, nothing touched, ended up with more vegetation than land that had been carefully replanted. The trees were killing the ground they were supposed to save. In the next 18 minutes, we are going to move through the full story of this project from 1978 to 2024 and find the moments where everything nearly fell apart, the people who refused to let it, and the one question that China's best scientists still cannot answer. Because the desert may be shrinking, but what is underneath the forest growing on top of it? Nobody is sure. A wall of brown air moves toward Beijing, not fog, not smoke. Sand arriving from 1,000 kilometers away, turning afternoon into night inside the city within minutes. It gets into buildings, it grounds flights, it turns the sky the color of old copper, and it does not stop for days. This was not a rare event. This was seasonal, predictable, getting worse every year. To understand what China was actually fighting, you have to look at the geography. A massive mountain range in the south blocks rain clouds from reaching the north, leaving China's entire northern region in a permanent dry zone. Rainfall there sits between 100 and 250 millimeters per year, compared to 1,500 millimeters in the farming south. The result, built up over centuries, was the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts, together covering more than 1.6 million square kilometers, an area larger than Iran, and it was growing. By the year 2000, nearly 30% of China's total land had turned to desert. The Gobi was advancing at 10,000 square kilometers per year, stripping 2,000 square kilometers of topsoil annually, and blowing it across borders into Japan, North Korea, and South Korea. Crops failed. Buildings were buried. These storms were not just a weather problem. They were destroying farmland across an entire continent. But here is what made it worse than a natural disaster. The main cause was not climate. It was people. Decades of overusing water, mining, over-farming, and cutting down trees had stripped the northern land of the ground cover that held it together. China was losing its land to China. The desert was growing not because nature demanded it, but because the habits feeding it had never been stopped. One city in northern Shanxi understood this better than anywhere else. Yulin, sitting on the edge of the Muas Desert, had watched the sand advance for generations. Not slowly, fast enough that exposed buildings were buried, fast enough that the city made a decision that has no modern equal. It moved its entire footprint. Not once, 3 times. The city of Yulin physically relocated further from the desert each time because staying meant being swallowed. 3 moves, not a metaphor, not a footnote. A city that picked itself up and moved because the ground it stood on was being taken. In 1978, the Chinese government looked at what was happening and made a decision that had never been made before at this scale. They were going to build a wall, not from stone, from trees. A continuous green barrier stretching thousands of kilometers across the northern frontier, designed to hold the desert back through nature alone. It was the most ambitious environmental project ever proposed. And almost immediately, it began to run into something the planners had not fully prepared for. The desert did not simply stop because something was planted in front of it. It kept coming. And in ways nobody predicted, the wall they were building would, in places, begin to help it. 23 years before the Great Green Wall was announced, a group of researchers at a desert research station faced a specific, urgent problem. The Baotou-Lanzhou Railway, a critical supply line running through northern China, was being swallowed by the Darkened Desert. Not damaged, not disrupted, swallowed. Sand dunes were moving across the tracks often enough that keeping the line running was becoming impossible. They needed to stop the dunes from moving. They had no money for machines. They had leftover crop waste and shovels. What they invented changed desert science permanently. Workers took wheat straw, dry, pale gold, smelling of old grain, and pressed it into the desert surface in crossing lines. Each square roughly 1 meter by 1 meter. Using shovels, they buried the middle of each bundle deep into the sand, leaving the ends sticking up like a low, rigid fence. From above, the desert began to look like graph paper. From the ground, it looked like nothing that had ever been done before. The physics of what happened next was simple but powerful. The straw walls broke up the flow of wind right at the surface of the soil, slowing it down just enough. Sand particles need a minimum wind speed to lift off the ground. Below that speed, they stay where they are. The checkerboard pushed the wind up above the surface, and the dune, for the first time, stopped moving. But that was only the beginning. Inside each protected square, something else was happening. Morning dew, trapped by the straw walls, dripped toward the center. Hardy native plants placed inside the squares received moisture that would otherwise have dried up before reaching any root. A young plant alive in the Darkened Desert, not because of rain, but because of water collected overnight from decomposing wheat straw. The desert at dawn, before the wind picks up, is almost perfectly silent. That silence is where the straw is working. Over years, the buried straw broke down. And as it did, it put the first organic material into otherwise lifeless sand. Tiny organisms established. A thin, dark soil crust formed, almost invisible, permanently locking the surface in place. A dune that had been moving for centuries held still. And then, slowly, it began to forget it was a dune. Plants grown inside these straw squares survived at rates of around 90%. The large-scale tree planting programs running at the same time in dry zones were struggling to reach 15%. The straw checkerboard was later used by South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ghana, Egypt, South Africa, and Mongolia. China's single most valuable desert technology was not a tree. It was crop waste, arranged by hand in a grid. By 1978, the technique had been refined for 23 years. The question was no longer whether it worked. The question was whether human beings could use it fast enough, and whether trees, which the government was betting everything on, could survive long enough for any of it to matter. That question had an answer, but it would take decades and a disaster or two to reach it. In 1962, a group of 126 college graduates arrived at a windy plateau in northern Hubei province. They had forestry degrees. They had basic equipment. They had almost nothing else. Their shelters were built from twigs and straw. Their food was potatoes and corn they grew themselves. Cold wind came in from the northwest at temperatures that made metal brittle, and it did not stop. They were 300 kilometers north of Beijing, standing on a bare highland called Saihanba, which means beautiful highlands in Mongolian, though nothing about it was beautiful anymore. Saihanba had once been forested. Logging, fire, and decades of unmanaged land use had stripped it completely. What was left was bare rock and blowing dust that sent sandstorms straight toward the capital. The government had sent these graduates to fix it, to plant a forest where no forest had survived in living memory. In the first 2 years, 90% of the young trees died, not because the graduates weren't working, because the Soviet-built planting machines they were using were designed for flat ground, and Saihanba's land was rocky and uneven. The machines couldn't push the roots deep enough. The saplings froze at the surface. The whole project was on the edge of being shut down entirely. Then a mechanical engineer named Ren Zhongyuan rebuilt the equipment. The change was not complicated, but it was exact. The new design allowed the planting arm to go past the shallow surface soil and push the roots down into the rock layer below. In the spring of 1964, 200 workers spent 40 straight days preparing the ground. When the season ended, they checked the survival rate. It was above 90%. 3 generations of foresters would spend their lives on that plateau. Some of them never saw what it became. What it became is now the largest man-made forest in the world. 750 square kilometers of trees. Forest cover rising from 10% to 80%. producing 550,000 metric tons of oxygen every year, and sending nearly 5 billion cubic feet of clean water each year to the people of Beijing and Tianjin. One rebuilt machine, one spring, 3 generations, that is what it took. But Sahanba was a government project, centrally funded, politically directed, staffed by state workers. It was one way of fighting the desert. 800 kilometers to the west, in the Gobi Desert of Inner Mongolia, something completely different was about to begin. And it started not with a government plan, but with a road that kept disappearing. In 1988, a man named Wang Wenbao took over a nearly bankrupt saltworks sitting in the center of the Gobi. The nearest railway station was 65 kilometers away. The direct route ran through open desert. Every time his workers tried to build a road through it, the moving dunes buried the road within weeks. Sandstorms stopped all transport. The long way around, the only other option, stretched 350 kilometers. The company was bleeding money just trying to move salt. Wang was not an environmentalist. He was a salt company manager trying to keep his business alive. And he reached a conclusion that was entirely practical. The saltworks could not make money until the desert around it was brought under control. So he started doing that, not because a government told him to, because the desert was costing him money every single day. That decision, made for business reasons by a private man running a nearly bankrupt operation, would eventually reclaim 1/3 of the entire Gobi Desert. But in 1988, standing at the edge of those dunes, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was sand, in every direction, and a road that the desert kept taking back. The Great Green Wall grew. Through the 1980s and 1990s, millions of trees were planted across China's northern provinces, poplars, willows, elms, planted in rows, planted fast, planted at a scale that had never been tried. The measure of success was coverage. How many trees, how many hectares, how many kilometers of green barrier standing against the sand? The numbers grew every year. The satellite images showed it. The reports confirmed it. And then in the 1980s, the bark of certain trees in the northeast began to show small, perfectly round holes, 3/8 of an inch wide, clean edges, a faint smell of fresh wood dust around the rim. The Asian long-horned beetle lays its eggs directly into tree bark. As the larvae hatch, they eat through the living layer between bark and wood, then bore deeper into the body of the tree, carving long tunnels through the interior. These tunnels cut off the vessels that carry water and food through the tree. The tree cannot feed itself. It cannot drink. When the adult beetles push out through the bark in summer, they leave those round exit holes and move to the next tree. The damaged wood lets in fungal infection. The tree weakens structurally. In wind or ice, it fails suddenly. In a mixed forest, this stays contained. Different species, different genetics, the beetle finds limits, but the northern shelter belts were not a mixed forest. They were millions of genetically identical poplars, planted in rows across thousands of kilometers. No variation, no resistance. One beetle population finding a continent-wide food supply with nothing to stop it. The beetle did not invade. It was invited. The planners had accidentally built the largest, most defenseless food source in the history of Chinese forestry. The beetle spread through the shelter belts with nothing in its way. Local governments, watching the trees die, made the only decision available. They sent workers back into forests they had spent 2 decades building, not to plant, but to cut. In Ningxia province alone, 80 million infected trees were cut down and destroyed. In neighboring Inner Mongolia, another 11 million came down. The wood was too damaged inside to be used for anything. Decades of work, government money, and careful planting were turned into a cutting operation with nothing at the end of it. And then, before the beetle crisis had fully settled, the year 2000 arrived. A separate disease moved through Ningxia's poplar plantations. Not the beetle, something different. In 12 months, 1 billion trees were dead. 20 years of planting. 1 year, gone. The same logic that made the beetle outbreak possible made this one possible too. Identical trees, no variation, no resistance, an entire province's worth of forest with a single weak point. The response at the policy level was to plant more trees. Because the system, the funding channels, the provincial planting targets, the political numbers tied to coverage, was so deeply built in that changing direction felt structurally impossible. The program continued. The trees went back in the ground, and underneath all of it, in the soil layers no satellite was measuring, something quieter and far more dangerous had already begun. Pull back from the beetle. Pull back from the cut trunks and the logging crews and the provincial reports. Go to orbit. Look at northern China in 2001 and then look again in 2017. The green cover has increased, clearly measurably from space. NASA confirmed it. China's satellites confirmed it. Independent research confirmed it. Between 2000 and 2017, China contributed approximately 25% of the entire global increase in vegetated land. From orbit, the numbers look like success. Now go underneath the image. Below the visible canopy, in the middle soil layers, 28 to 100 centimeters down, and in the deeper layers below that, something had been quietly changing for years with no sign of it in any satellite image. The trees were using water. Not just the rain that fell from the sky, there was rarely enough of that. They were using the water stored in the soil from decades past, the water sitting in deep underground layers, the groundwater the entire region's water system depended on. And they were using it faster than it was being replaced. An ecologist named Shixin had been recording this for years. His research showed that dense plantations in dry zones used between 20 and 40% more water than the native grasses and shrubs they replaced. Native plants had existed in balance with available rainfall for thousands of years. The planted trees had not. They needed more water than the sky was giving them, so they reached deeper into the ground, and deeper, and the water table began to fall. As the trees got bigger, their need for water grew. As the water table dropped below the reach of roots, the trees began to weaken. Trees under water stress put all remaining energy into basic survival and stopped producing the chemical defenses that protect them. The same physical breakdown that made the poplars easy targets for the beetle was happening again, silently, across thousands of kilometers of plantation. Not from a pest this time, from thirst. On the Les Plateau, planted trees reduced river flow by more than 25%. Across afforestation sites in northern China, the number of different plant species dropped by an average of 52%, because the trees were taking the limited water away from native grasses and shrubs, killing the ground cover beneath them, removing the very layer of plants that held the surface soil in place. And then Cao's team found the result that should not have been possible. In test plots in northern Shanxi, researchers compared two pieces of land side by side. Land that had been carefully replanted, planted, managed, monitored, and land that had simply been left alone, nothing planted, nothing done, ignored. When they measured total plant coverage, the abandoned land had more. The replanted plots showed a net drop in vegetation of 6% compared to land that no one had touched. The trees had used up the water, killed the ground cover beneath them. And then, as they weakened and died, left behind soil with no seeds, no ground layer, and rows of dead trunks placed perfectly to channel wind between them, speeding it up, increasing erosion, making worse the exact problem they were planted to stop. A forest built to hold the desert back had become a tool for the desert's return. Chinese forestry scientists have since found the exact point where this breakdown begins. For certain tree types in these dry zones, the system works best at exactly 1,000 trees per hectare. Go past that number and the forest begins to destroy itself. The early programs had no such limit. They planted as many trees as possible, as fast as possible, because the measure of success was coverage, not whether what was planted would actually survive. That measure has since changed. But what is happening right now, beneath the forests that currently look healthy in satellite images, does not yet have a clear answer. Go back to the Kubuki. Not the Kubuki of 1988 with its moving dunes and a salt company trying to build a road. The Kubuki of now. 650,000 solar panels are arranged across the desert floor in the shape of a running horse. Beneath them, in the bands of shade they cast across the sand, grass is growing. Crops are planted in rows. Sheep move between the panel supports. A team of 47 local households arrives each morning to clean the panels with high-pressure water, and the water from that cleaning drips directly down onto the crops and pasture planted below. The water used to maintain the solar farm is also the irrigation system. Nothing is wasted. The desert in this specific place has been rebuilt as a closed-loop system. This is what adjustment looks like. The Gobi survived what destroyed other plantations for specific reasons. Wang Wenbiao's operation ran on private motivation, which meant survival mattered more than coverage numbers. Early on, Ilian discovered that paying workers per tree planted produced near total death rates. The workers had no personal stake in whether the trees lived after they left. Payment structures were rebuilt around long-term survival. Survival rates climbed. The financial model lined up with the biological one. The key innovation was licorice, a plant of extraordinary toughness, low water needs, and tolerance for freezing desert nights. Ilian's agriculture team introduced a specific growing method. Rather than growing licorice upward, they trained it to spread sideways. A single plant's root system covered a full square meter of ground, multiplying the soil stabilizing effect tenfold. The roots pulled nitrogen from the air and pushed it directly into the sand. After 4 years, the licorice was harvested and sold into the traditional medicine market. The soil left behind was transformed, darker, more solid, biologically alive, ready to support other crops. Watermelons, tomatoes, grapes, potatoes. Where nothing had grown in living memory, there was now farmland. The desert at dusk beneath 650,000 solar panels, light coming through in long, flat bars across the sand, falling in lines of gold and shadow. Somewhere below those panels, in soil that was bare lifeless sand 30 years ago, a crop is growing. The physical results of the Gobi model are documented. Annual rainfall in the region rose from 100 millimeters in 1988 to 456 millimeters in 2016, more than 4 times the original level. Sandstorm events dropped from 50 per year to 1. More than 6,250 square kilometers, roughly 1/3 of the entire desert, have been reclaimed and turned green. 14.5 million metric tons of carbon have been pulled from the atmosphere. The United Nations valued the project's total benefit to the ecosystem at USD 5.1 billion. But here is what the rainfall number does not settle. Scientists cannot confirm whether the rainfall increased because of the tree planting, because the vegetation changed the local climate enough to pull in more moisture, or whether it increased because of natural climate shifts that happened to line up with the planting period. The desert may be greening because of what was built, or the conditions may have changed on their own, and the planting worked partly because the timing was lucky. Both explanations fit the data. Neither has been ruled out. In November 2024, China announced the completion of a 3,000-kilometer greenbelt fully surrounding the Taklamakan Desert, the largest desert encirclement in human history. The Gobi, which was taking 10,000 square kilometers of land per year in the 1980s, is now shrinking at more than 2,000 square kilometers a year. A swing of 12,000 square kilometers per year in the right direction. By every visible measurement, something extraordinary has happened. The question, the one that stays, is what happens next. And what is happening right now in the layers the satellites cannot reach. The desert did not retreat because it was beaten. It retreated because the conditions it needed, bare sand, no shade, maximum evaporation, high wind speed, were systematically removed from specific places. When those conditions changed, the desert had nowhere left to exist in that space. It moved on, not because it was stopped. Because the ground beneath it was no longer what it required. That difference matters more than it might seem. We began this with a number. 78 billion trees, a number large enough to feel like a final answer. But the full story, from 1978 to 2024, does not move in a straight line from problem to solution. It moves through a city that relocated 3 times, through a salt company owner who needed a road, through 126 forestry graduates eating potatoes in freezing wind and watching 90% of their trees die, through a mechanical engineer who rebuilt a broken Soviet machine over a single winter and changed everything, through 1 billion trees killed in a single year by a single disease, through forests that drank the groundwater they needed to survive and left the soil beneath them more bare than open sand. The satellite image from space shows green where there was brown. That is real. The deserts are measurably smaller. That is real. Sahanba is the largest man-made forest on Earth, covering 750 square kilometers, where 3 generations of people gave their working lives to something they could not fully see while they were building it. That is real. And still, in 2024, 26.8% of China's total land is desert. The project that is the most ambitious environmental effort in human history has not finished the job. It has changed the rate of loss. It has, in places, reversed it. But the system underneath, the water reserves, the deep soil moisture, the groundwater the forests are drawing from, is not visible in any satellite image. It is not measured by any canopy cover report. What is happening in those layers beneath the forests that currently look healthy is a question the data has not yet answered. The desert is patient. It has been here longer than any forest. And in some places, beneath the green, it is simply waiting. If you are someone who cannot look at a success story without asking what it cost, this channel is for you. We follow the full story of the systems that shape the world, what was built, what failed, what was learned, and what is still unresolved. Every video goes past the headline and into the part of the story that does not have a clean ending. If that is the kind of knowledge you want, subscribe. There is more where this came from.